Welcome to you all to QUT. My name is Angela Daly and I'm Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow in the Faculty of Law, Intellectual Property and Innovation Programme, and I'll be chairing this forum. Just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. In keeping with the spirit of reconciliation here at QUT, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where QUT now stands, and I recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning. I wish to pay my respect to the elders of the traditional owners, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. So, this forum, as you know, is on access to essential medicines and has been organised today to coincide with the visit of the Honourable Michael Kirby to QUT. We have 6 presenters, all of whom will be talking for about 10 minutes each on topics related to the recommendations of the United Nations Secretary-General's high-level panel on access to medicines, and we'll be covering various topics from various disciplinary perspectives as well, but including kind of intellectual property, public health and international law. So as I mentioned, we've got kind of 6 presenters. I will introduce each of them before they speak. And as I said, they will be speaking for about 10 minutes. And I will also signal to the presenters when 10 minutes is gone to get them to kind of wrap up. Otherwise, we will not finish in time. And if we have some time at the end for general questions, that's when the questions will be. But first up, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Matthew Rimmer, who is the professor here at QUT of IP and Innovation Law. And he will be talking firstly about the now seemingly ill-fated Trans-Pacific Partnership, so intellectual property, public health and access to essential medicines as part of the TPP.
Ladies and gentlemen, this talk is about the rise and fall of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and looking at intellectual property, public health and access to essential medicines. And my talk is really going to provide some context for today's discussion about the United Nations Secretary-General's high-level panel report on access to medicines. And I really see the report as a reaction, in part, against some of the trends that can be seen in relation to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The push for stronger, longer intellectual property rights protection, particularly in relation to pharmaceutical drugs, but also in relation to medicines and biotechnology. So my talk today is a much more compressed version of a longer paper that I'm publishing for the Intellectual Property Journal in Canada with Osgood Hall. And really that paper piece explores in much finer detail some of the measures and provisions that are proposed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The ill-fated Trans-Pacific Partnership was a mega regional agreement cutting across the Pacific Rim. Initially it started out as quite a modest venture with New Zealand trying to attract the attention of the United States to achieve a large trade agreement. But under the leadership of President Barack Obama, the agreement quickly expanded in terms of its range of membership, but it also kind of expanded in terms of its range of content. And amongst other things, the kind of agreement in particular led to a number of proposals in relation to intellectual property, public health and access to medicines. The agreement was very controversial because of its very secretive and closed negotiating process, and there was a lot of concern that within that process there was a large degree of industry capture of some of the content in relation to the agreement. President Barack Obama in particular was something of a paradox as the champion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. While at home he promoted Obamacare and affordable medicines, in the Pacific Rim he pushed for higher standards of intellectual property protection across the Pacific Rim. And this caused a great deal of disquiet, particularly amongst public health advocates like MSF, but also cancer patients like Sahara protested vigorously about some of the implications of the Trans-Pacific Partnership for access to affordable medicine throughout the Pacific Rim. And my talk today is quickly going to skip over 4 simple matters. Firstly, I just want to kind of put the debate in a little bit of historical context, talk about some of the measures proposed in terms of patent law, and then secondary measures like data protection, market exclusivity, biologics and trade secrets. But principally I just want to talk about the response of the World Health Organization, the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicines. I guess the really important point to make is that there's been a long-standing geopolitical debate over access to essential medicines. So Michael Kirby first started to engage with these issues back in the 1980s when there were patent races between the Americans and the French in respect of HIV/AIDS research. And at the time he was very kind of concerned that those patent races were very kind of destructive of scientific cooperation and collaboration, but also in terms of rapidly responding to some of the problems that were rising. In the 1990s, the issues gained even more significance and prominence, with 39 of the world's largest drug companies suing Nelson Mandela's government over trying to make generic medicines from India in particular much more accessible. And as a result, there are a number of resolutions and declarations designed to resolve and overcome some of the conflicts in relation to intellectual property and access to essential medicines. So the Doha Declaration in 2001 recognised that nation states could make use of flexibilities to address public health issues. The WTO General Council decision in 2003 set in place an export mechanism to export drugs to developing countries and least developed countries that lacked local drug manufacturing capacity. And in 2017, we finally have in the WTO the WTO General Council decision being included in the TRIPS agreement as an amendment. The TPP sits very awkwardly against the background of those resolutions and understandings. The TPP is a TRIPS double plus agreement. It builds upon the TRIPS agreement and TRIPS plus agreements like the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement, while having some recognition of the importance of those previous declarations. There's no positive obligations to take action in relation to access to essential medicines. So there's a lot of concern that there's lip service in the Trans-Pacific Partnership about those issues relating to access to essential medicines. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has very voluminous, detailed, complex and prescriptive language in relation to matters of patent law. In particular, there was a lot of debate during the negotiations over patentable subject matter. Initially, there were some quite expansive approaches to patentable subject matter, but as the negotiations wore on, those efforts, particularly by the United States Trade Representative to have a broad approach to patentable subject matter, broke down. And in part, that was also because there was a kind of a radical revolution happening in the Supreme Court of the United States. So with the Bilski, Alice, Prometheus and Myriad cases, you had the Supreme Court of the United States trying to narrow what was patentable subject matter in subtle ways. The Myriad litigation in the United States was particularly significant in terms of rejecting patents in relation to genetic testing for breast cancer and ovarian cancer on the basis that it was too close to trying to patent products of nature. The High Court of Australia subsequently had a parallel decision in which it kind of rejected the patents of Myriad Genetics on the basis that they were trying to claim intellectual information. But obviously there was also a lot of controversy over patent standards and evergreening and the language in the agreement in relation to patent thresholds and the problem of drugs companies and biotech companies trying to overcome the patent cliff by finding ways of extending the life of patents. And much more centrally, there was also a lot of discussion about the text on the TPP on patent term extensions in relation to pharmaceutical drugs. In Australia, there's been a great deal of concern about both the indirect problem of evergreening and the direct problem of patent term extensions. The report by Di Nicol and others, and the Productivity Commission report, which came out last year, highlighted the high cost of patent term extensions, particularly in Australia, after Prime Minister John Howard agreed to those measures. So the agreement is very kind of significant in trying to push that particular agenda. And as Bruce Arnold might explore later on, there was also an effort to export some of the patent registration linkage models in the United States law to overseas. In addition to that, there was all these supplementary forms of intellectual property protection that were mooted in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The United States was very keen on getting data protection, but in addition to that, there was a huge battle over whether or not there should be special protection in relation to biologics recognised in the TPP, and if so, what should be the term of protection in the final text. And it's very notable that Malcolm Turnbull resisted the demands of Barack Obama to adopt the current US standards in relation to the protection of biologics. Also very controversial was the inclusion of not only civil remedies but criminal penalties and procedures in relation to trade secrets. Above and beyond the intellectual property chapter, there was also some notable other chapters that would impact public health. There was a lot of controversy about the investment chapter, which had an investor-state dispute resolution system, which would enable intellectual property owners to bring investor actions against governments in certain situations in relation to intellectual property rights. There was also a lot of controversy over the misnamed Transparency Annex, which wasn't very transparent, which seemed to be a very coded way to enable private healthcare players to have a greater say in terms of the operation of public health regulation systems. So this kind of regional model presented a very fundamental challenge to some of the multilateral frameworks that had been developed in relation to public health. Dr. Margaret Chan of the World Health Organization in particular was very concerned about how the Trans-Pacific Partnership would affect human rights, access to medicines, and larger questions about equality. And those concerns were certainly kind of taken up during some of the United Nations Secretary General's discussions about access to medicines. The Honourable Michael Kirby played a very kind of key role in this process as a kind of an expert advisor, but really the panel featured a number of large superstars in the field of access to essential medicines, but also a range of different national leaders. And they were really kind of concerned about trying to overcome some of the old divisions and conflicts over intellectual property and access to essential medicines. And one of their key recommendations was really kind of tackling the question of trade and intellectual property, and trying to have a new approach to dealing with intellectual property and public health. So rather curtly, the report noted that the recent TPP is emblematic of the new generation of bilateral and multilateral trade and investment agreements, which include TRIPS Plus provisions that progressively ratchet up intellectual property and enforcement. And they also noted the inclusion of investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms and other provisions that may significantly reduce the scope of measures that national governments can use to pursue public health priorities and fulfil the right to health. But moreover, they kind of have the very pithy statement that ensuring that future trade agreements do not interfere with policies that guarantee the right to health for all is essential for resolving the incoherence between trade agreements and the human right to health. To wrap up, by conclusion, I think a number of the issues in relation to access to medicines that were raised by the UN Secretary General's high-level panel remain important. Even though the future of the TPP is in doubt, there's a lot of concern about policy laundering in relation to those measures and similar sorts of text appearing in other contexts. And really, the US election has led to the rather premature collapse of the TPP. Bernie Sanders was very much against the TPP. Hillary Clinton equivocated in terms of her position on the agreement from support to reservations to opposition. But Donald Trump has rather dramatically withdrawn the United States from the negotiations of the TPP and the agreement by executive order. There's been a lot of discussion about whether the TPP could survive as a TPP minus USA deal, which Australia and New Zealand promoted. But Canada and Japan have said that they've been unwilling to submit to the demands in the TPP without the inclusion of the United States and the access to the markets that the United States would involve. Having said that, I'm not sure that Donald Trump has rejected the TPP for some of the reservations that I've raised in relation to public health. As we'll hear later from Bruce Arnold, Trump's position in relation to drug prices is a very complicated one. On the one hand, he has expressed sometimes concern about the high cost of drug prices, but then he has also pushed for deregulation and reducing tax burdens in relation to pharmaceutical drug companies. But also he seems very alarmed about the prospect of trade secrets theft from flagship American companies, particularly by parties from China and other rivals and competitors. So his kind of position is not necessarily one that would promote public health. But anyway, that's all from me, and the following speakers are going to explore other particular dimensions of the debate over access to medicines and analyse other key statements and proposals by the United Nations Secretary-General's High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines. Thank you.